Welcome to our Iniciação Científica presentations. My name is Isabela Becker, I'm from Year 9B, and today I'll present about child trafficking, protection, and challenges in the United Nations documents. Well, in 2020, I studied about the adolescents and children's rights in the United Nations documents, being that my base theme for the project. In 2021, I went deeper in the theme by studying one of children's violations, the human trafficking. Child trafficking can be defined as one of the ways of human trafficking. So the practice is done by kidnapping and hiding the identity of kids for different purposes, such as sexual abuse, illegal organ removal, forced labor, illegal adoption, and among others. Child trafficking is the third illegal activity that obtains more income around the globe, just losing for forgery and drug trafficking. In the beginning of my research, I decided some objectives that guided me during my project. The general one was to understand children's rights guaranteed by the United Nations and the work carried out by it in the fight against child trafficking. The specific ones were to discover children's and adolescents' rights in the United Nations documents and in the Brazilian Constitution. The second one was to identify the social characteristics associated with child trafficking and abuse. These social characteristics are the purposes that I just mentioned. And lastly, present projects developed in the fight against child trafficking. Related to my methodology and research, I divided my work into three parts. The first one, I studied about the historical path of child trafficking, through the In the first part of my research, I studied the historical path of child trafficking through Venson 2013 scientific article. At the end of my research, I could conclude that child trafficking was first practiced in the classic antiquity, but its combat was just initiated in the early 90s. In the second part of my research, I studied about the purposes of child trafficking to World Health Organization and International Labour Organization articles. I could conclude that among all the purposes of child trafficking, sexual abuse is the most practiced, representing 16.9% of all the other practices. Lastly, in the last part of my research, I studied about the combat that is being done to child trafficking. United Nations, UNICEF, together with private and public companies and ONGs such as Together for Girls and Global Alliance to End Child and Sexual Exploitation online, through collecting data, doing speeches, spreading awareness, and influencing schools to teach about the subject, they are combating child trafficking. It's recommended by the authorities to call 100 in any case of suspicion of child trafficking. That number applies to human rights violations. Well, it can be concluded that it's important to emphasize that child trafficking is an old practice compared to the initial combat. The United Nations reinforces the need for support and spreading awareness of the subject. And for these various purposes of child trafficking, we have different ways of combating. This combat can be done by private and public companies, but from us, members of the community as well. Thank you all for the attention.